There's my Twitter, my Google+ shortcut, my website, and today's talk. You can follow along if you'd like. In case I don't get to all my slides, there's a couple of bonus slides after the end that I'll get to if we have time or not. This is only using standardized open web technology stuff, but that doesn't mean it's all supported. So it works well in Chrome. It probably works well in the new Safari. It may not work as well everywhere else. I know it gets a little screwy in Firefox right now, but that's fine. So today I'm going to talk about one spec I've written and one spec I didn't, variables and conditional rules. These are both productivity style specs. They're not sexy features by themselves. They're not used to produce effects directly. These are things to make you as an author more productive and make your life easier. And I hope that I can show a lot of really cool examples of how it will do that exactly. And if we have time, we'll get into some of the future of variables, which is pretty exciting. To me, at least. I don't know, I'm a nerd. So first, a little bit of history. Variables have been the #1 developer request for forever. If you follow this link in the slide on your own, it'll take you to a really ancient developer request page that Daniel put together and a few other people. And variables have been on there since 15 years ago. That's kind of ridiculous. Oh, and by the way, I tend to speak really fast. I'm trying to speak as slow as I can. PBK will try to wave at me, but all of y'all can just boo if I start speeding up too much. That'll be really helpful. All right. So the last big attempt at variables was done by Daniel Glasman here and Dave Hyatt, a WebKit hacker, and it looked something like this. You would declare a set of variables in an @ rule and then use them in a property just with a var function. But we didn't actually create variables, and so the CSS preprocessors picked up the slack over time as they've come in. We have a simple example of how they look in Sass, where they use the $sign, less, where they use an @ sign. And my first attempt at variables looked almost identical. It used an @ rule, var, and then used the $sign similar to Sass. This is what I tried to get at first, but that one didn't work out. The reason was variables here looked too similar to what the processors were doing. It didn't give us anything more. It was exactly what the preprocessors were doing, actually. And it was hard to sell why we should put this into pure CSS if the processors could do it so well by themselves. So I had to come up with some way to make variables worthwhile to be put into CSS, something that only CSS itself could do that we can't do well via a preprocessor doing it all on the server. And I've done that. Here's an example of modern variables as the spec currently stands. Now, this probably isn't very impressive. It looks very similar to the old one, but there's some very distinct difference, particularly this bit right here. Oh, that looks terrible when I highlight it. All right, but that bit right there, where var main color is inside of a style rule. This is declaring a variable named main color as a property, a custom property, in fact. I can use any name I want there as long as it has a var dash in front of it and give it any value I want. This establishes a variable, and I can then use that further down. Now, this, again, looks a lot like existing preprocessor-based variables, except that since it's a property, it acts just like every other property in CSS. In particular, it inherits down. You can use the cascade to have multiple declarations of a variable, and one of them wins out based on specificity, etc. In fact, I've got a quick list of some of the differences between CSS-style variables and preprocessor-style variables. The big thing is, because it's a property, you can scope variables to particular parts of the tree. I'll have an example of that in a little bit, but that means you can declare a global version of a variable and then have widgets that change the variables, still use the same ones of the page, but want to tweak their colors. And they can adjust those without affecting anything else on the page. Also, because it's just a property, you can access it, read it, and alter it just like any other property using element.style. And because of the scoping aspect, this works really well with the new web components effort, if you've heard anything about that from Google I/O recently. Web components and variables work super good for theming. In fact, it's one of the core ways you do theming on web components. You can declare a few things that you can alter, like the background of your widget or something, and just use a variable as the way to pass that information in. There are some cons to doing it this way, though, some benefits that the preprocessor style variables had, and we might address those in the future. The biggest one is, because it's a property, it's only useful on elements. In particular, we can't use these kinds of variables to substitute out parts of media queries, parts of selectors, etc. There are some other ways that we're going to attempt to address that in the future, but for now we're somewhat limited here, but this is still most of the use cases. So we're going to run through a couple of use cases for variables. Some of these should be obvious, some of these will be new and hopefully will spur your creativity in there. The first one we're going to hit is the most obvious use case for variables, theming a page. Simple example here, these are two real colors I've had to use in a style guide before, developed by the advertising people back when I was a web developer. One of them's an orange, one of them's a yellow. I can't remember what the hell they are. I'd have to copy paste every time. I just had a sheet of paper next to my screen while I was developing this web page with the page colors on it so that I could write them down without having to copy paste constantly. Variables eliminates all of this. Instead of having to constantly rewrite the colors, and if I ever change it, do a copy paste and hope that I catch everything, or not a copy paste, search and replace, and hope I catch everything, I can just put those colors into a variable, give them a name, and then use them that way. This is super obvious. This is just what you do in every programming language so that you're not repeating yourself over and over again, but it's finally here in CSS. In a similar instance, let's scroll down a little bit so we can see all of this. If you're doing, say, a column-based design where you have, a grid-based design, where you're splitting your page into several columns and some elements might span 2 or 3 columns, etc., you can use variables inside of anything, other expression. They just get replaced with their value. So in here, the .section class spans 3 columns and the 2 gutters that are in there. And you can just make a nice complicated calc expression. You can do whatever you want with it. They just get subbed in for their original value. A related bit about theming is what I said before about them being scoped. Here I have the main color being declared on the root element of the document. That's a global variable, more or less. And then the variable being changed inside of a widget. So a P anywhere in the document, when it uses the main color variable, we'll get gray, we'll get the blue value declared up on the root. But something inside of the widget, using the exact same variable, will get the gray color. And they won't affect each other too much. So that's really nice for encapsulation. Another case related to this is getting the numerical constants that you might use out of your code. You may have seen something like this showing up in your style sheets or those of others, where you just have some random ass percentage. You don't know what it really means. You have to go reduce it. Maybe you can guess at the percentage. In this case, 41.6667 is 5/12. So this is terrible to see in your style sheet. For one thing, you have no idea how many decimal points you should use. For two, you just see this, you don't know what it is. You can't see immediately in your head, okay, that's 5 parts out of 12. It's opaque. A better way right now, of course, would be to use calc, as in the middle one, where it at least makes it clearer. But that's a little verbose to put all over your document. Somewhat better is to use a variable to abstract that away. We can just calculate it once, put it in a well-named variable, percentage 5-12, and then use that whenever we need something that covers 5/12. And I can just define 12 of those if I wanted, and have a really nicely descriptive style sheet where whenever I see something like that, I know immediately this should cover 5/12 of the element. Similarly, if you're, say, wanting to use the golden ratio to make some of those perfect rectangles, you want to use phi, the golden ratio itself. That might not be really obvious to most people who aren't math nerds. So they see a 1.618, it's not obvious what the hell it means. Using variables, again, you give it a nice name, and suddenly it's descriptive. You know now that this .foo element should be a nice rectangle with the golden ratio of its sides. Fun little bit here. Ooh, okay, there was one bit I was going to do that I can do on Linux. I had no idea how to do it on here. How do you type Unicode characters? I don't want to bother with that. Whatever. So if I was doing this on my computer, where it would be showing Ubuntu. What? Command Option T? Let's see if this works. And then
it should open the special character.
It didn't open anything, so. All right, never mind. All right, so if I was on my normal computer, which I'm running Ubuntu, I could have replaced the phi with the actual Greek phi character and the pi with the actual Greek pi character, and it would have worked. Variables can have any name you want with any characters, almost. Within the ASCII range, it can be letters, numbers, dashes, or underscores, but outside of ASCII, they're all valid. So if it would make your style sheet more readable to use the actual Greek constant, that is traditionally given to phi or pi, go for it. It's totally valid and looks really nice if you have an easy way of typing it. Yeah. Another fun use for variables here is as fake shorthands. You know, the shorthands that we have for background, etc., are really useful because you can set a whole swath of properties in one go and then adjust bits of them with the longhands that it's made up of. But some properties that look like they should have shorthands don't. Box shadow, for example. It has some very distinct components, the X, the Y, the color, the blur, but they're not split apart. This is the end point of a property. So if you don't want to do something simple like this, where on hover you just make it blur more, you have to repeat the entire thing. If it was a proper shorthand, you could just say box shadow blur 5 pixel in the hover rule, but we can't. In variables though, we can kind of do that. We can hack around the lack for now. As this example shows, put the blur into a variable, use that in the property instead, and then just adjust the variable in the hover state. And it achieves the same thing without all the repetition. Much less typing, much better maintainability. If you ever need to change something, part of the box shadow, you don't have to make 8 changes now or more. You just make the 4 in the one place that you're defining it. It's a lot better maintainability. Finally, somewhat interesting use here, but which will potentially be the most important, is using custom properties as author prefixes. Vendors, or browser vendors, whenever they're defining their own properties, put a dash WebKit or a dash Moz in front of things. We can't do that. If we make our own custom properties, normally they just get thrown away as invalid. Anything you put into a var, though, gets kept. So you can pretend that the var dash is just an author prefix, and those properties are just for you. You can go ahead and define whatever you want. They don't have to be valid CSS values. They can be literally anything. And then use JavaScript to go through, find those, and act on them. That way you can do polyfills, shims, etc., creating properties that don't exist yet, but are filled in by JavaScript with a nice hack around it. This is something that's really important in the start of making CSS user extensible, which I believe is very, very important for the future of CSS. We can't anticipate every need that's ever going to happen. We need to make sure that y'all have the tools in your own hands to do a lot of CSS yourself, so then we can come back and afterwards see what's popular and just standardize that stuff. That way there's not so much pressure on us to do everything. That way there's not so much delay for y'all whenever y'all want to get something new and awesome. Okay, let's see. How long have I been so far? Yeah, I know. I'm just wanting to know my timing. It sounds like we're going to get to the future, so this is cool. All right. So conditional rules is the second part of my talk. This is the spec I didn't write. This one was written by David Barron. The conditional rules spec is a generalization of media queries. It takes the concept of media queries and makes it a more general just conditions of various kinds. Right now, it only has the supports rule in it. Previously, it had the document rule, which if you've ever written rules using Mozilla's stylish extension, the Moz document at rule appeared there, and it let you target styles for particular pages by just putting a URL into there. But that got punted over to the next level. It should show up in conditionals level 4. For now, we just have supports, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So the supports rule lets you test whether or not a property is supported by the browser. If you've ever used Modernizer or similar libraries, this is exactly what that does, except built in. You don't have to run any JavaScript. You don't have to have tests be running and eating up CPU before you can display things. And importantly, you have more efficient selectors, which I'll show in a second. It's just like media in that you just have the at rule, your conditions, and then you put a bunch of style rules inside of it. So there's a ton of great examples in the actual spec. If you're following along, click this link, scroll down past all the grammar crap, and find example 5. That's where it starts being good. In fact, some of these examples I have here are just copy-pasted from the spec because they're really useful. Wasn't worth writing fresh ones. So let's hit some of those up. Here is a basic usage of the supports rule. If Flexbox is supported, use it. Have fun. If Flexbox is not supported, do some float-based stuff. Very simple, very easy, and this couldn't be done well in today's world without supports. But this isn't ideal here. Browsers throw away rules they don't understand. So if you try to use this today, every old browser, anybody that's not some of the newest ones that have just gotten support for it, will ignore the entire thing. You'll have no layout code whatsoever. So here's a slightly better version of that code with proper fallback. Outside of any supports rule, just as plain old style rules at the top level of your style sheet, you go ahead and do your old style layout, float-based, percentages, whatever. And then you do a supports rule just for the new stuff. You set up flex at whatever you want to do, and you unset anything that needs to be undone. Here I did a width auto to wipe out the percentage widths that got put on everything. This is a nice forwards compatible and backwards compatible way to handle the supports rule that works in old browsers as well. The @supports rule also supports prefixes. If you put in a property it doesn't understand, it'll just go ahead and say, yeah, I don't understand it. That part's false. But you can combine multiple ones together to get a nice composite condition. Here I test for box shadow or all the prefixed ones. If any of those evaluate to true, I'm going to go ahead and run the supports rule. Note the plain code adds just a thick border. Well, not thick border, a 1 pixel border. But I really want that to be a 1 pixel box shadow. So that's what I do down here. I set up a box shadow using all the various prefixes and remove the border that I had set there, again, resetting my fallback code to nothing. Support queries, as you saw in that one, can be combined together. You can use not to negate anything and an or to combine them together into a larger query, so you can test for everything that you might need in that block. The small details here, if you use and or and not in most programming languages, there's some precedence rules you can rely on, so you don't need that many parentheses. Those have never been very obvious, and so to avoid having to worry about those at all, if you want to mix the 3 types of modifiers, you must use extra parentheses. Here's a quick example. The first one is invalid code. It uses an or and an and at the same level. So you'd have to know which one comes first. And we didn't want to define that. So the second one is a correct version of this, one possible version here, where you test for transition or animation or and the transform stick. Or you can do it the other way around, move the parentheses down so it tests for transition or animation and transform. Whatever is the correct thing that you want to do. Just note that you will definitely need extra parentheses like all the time. It gets kind of verbose there. Now, if you have any sense of history in the web, this kind of thing has been done before. That's just terrible. I'm just going to call it has feature. The has feature was the last big attempt to try to let authors detect what's supported. And this failed terribly. Browsers just lied left and right about these features. And there's a simple reason why. There was no connection between the true or false that the function returned and what was actually happening in the browser. It was just a table somewhere in the code that somebody set up, true, false, whatever. They don't have to care what's in there. They can put whatever value they want. They have the source code. Supports tries to avoid this. We specifically define that the true or false that you return from the supports rule is tied to your ability to parse the property successfully. If you don't understand the property, you won't parse it. It will be an unknown property. That's the only time you return false, and you only return true if you can successfully understand the whole thing. There's still a small chance of false positives here. There's been a few times in the past that Modernizer has complained about where a browser will parse a property and make it look like it's working, but it doesn't actually do anything. Those are rare, though. We complain about them pretty loudly whenever they happen because they break our simple method of feature detection. And so browsers are pretty good about not doing that anymore. Generally, supports should be truthful. That doesn't mean it's perfect. Saying that you support a property doesn't mean you support it well. Simple example, position fixed on mobile is a travesty. So if you tried to search for position fixed, try to do a supports for position fixed, it's not going to do you any good on mobile. It doesn't mean anything. It'll say true, but it's not. It's not true. But this is the best we can do. There's no other way we can do it that's not going to have a much worse failure mode more commonly. So we are okay with the occasional failure like that in return for it mostly being right. Finally, Supports, like media, has JavaScript support. You don't need to put a rule into a style sheet and then do some fancy hacks to see if it works correctly. You can just ask it directly, do you support something? We've got 2 versions of it. The first one, listed up here, takes two values, a property and the value. It's a very simple version. It just does one single property at a time, and then you can use JavaScript, not, and whatnot to combine them if you want. Or you can pass an entire condition string, parentheses and all, and just have that evaluated. Whatever feels more natural to you, whatever's a little bit better. The nice part about the first one is you don't need the parentheses, because everybody forgot about that whenever we first tried to introduce just the second version. And so that's why we put the first version in. It's just a little bit more natural to somebody doing JavaScript. But they're both there if you need them. Note that this is hanging off of a CSS global value. We're going to put a bunch more things on there. It's a nice convenient namespace for CSS-related functions so that we can give things nice, short, descriptive names without having to worry about colliding with some of your stuff that you put in the page. So expect more stuff on the CSS object in the future. This is just the first of them. OK, so that was the fake end. I appear to have time left over, so let's go into the bonus slides. How much time do I have?
Take at least 20 minutes.
Sweet, all right. We'll do whatever. Yeah. Yeah, whenever we hit questions, by the way, do not limit them to these slides. I can answer frickin' anything, so. So we're going to hit some stuff about the future of variables right now. Level 1 variables is intentionally very simple. It's actually a rather hard feature to implement well, so I wanted to make it as bare bones as I could get while still being useful. So that it had a better chance of being bug-free and implemented fairly quickly. But as soon as it's done, as soon as we start getting implementation showing up, and we do have some starting right now, I'm going to go ahead and work on a level 2 with some new features. So I'm going to talk about a few of those right now. The first big feature is a parent var function. This is exactly like var, except that it looks at the parent's value of a variable instead of your value of a variable. This lets you collect values as you go down the tree. And I have an example coming up just as in the next slide. So here's a basic nested tree, and I'm going to show you the hover effect. Note that as you hit everything, it highlights the whole line and whatnot, and that's cool. That's very simple. This is just basic CSS. But note that the hover only starts at the text. It doesn't go all the way back to the start, and a lot of times that might be what you want. For example, I only know if it works for sure in Windows, but if you have a tree structure in a Windows dialog, and you highlight a nested row, it highlights the entire line all the way through. Makes it a little bit easier to see. As we can see in this next version here, where it hides the entire thing. Now you can do stuff like this in normal CSS. That's what I'm doing right here, but it's a dirty hack. If I go and look at the actual code for it, all right, let's bump that up a bit. Command plus, let's guess. Yes, it worked. All right, note right here, padding left 2em on the 2 nested LIs. I have a single LI, 1em, 2 LIs, 2em, 3 LIs, 3em. I have to manually put in the stacking level there. This won't go arbitrarily deep. It'll only go as deep as I anticipated. And that sucks, because the previous version, the one that doesn't look as good, this one goes as deep as you want. It doesn't matter. You can make it 100 levels deep and it still works. This one doesn't in today's code, and it can't be without some really filthy hacks. I'm not even going to go into them. But with variables, it's really, really simple. This is all you would need, plus the additional actual styling. You set up a variable called indent or something, and use parent var to look at the parent and see what its value was, and then add 1em to it. This way, every time you see a tree element, this would be, I guess, the ULs, you increase the size of the indent variable by 1em. It's 1em on the first, 2em on the second, 3em on the third, and that happens automatically. You don't have to do anything special. And then you just use that as a padding. This will let you achieve the effect shown in this example with arbitrarily deep trees. No need to make it a little bit hacky or whatever. There's a lot more uses here, but this is one of the most obvious examples I could show. So it'll be interesting seeing what everybody comes up with for this. Another thing I want to do is add default values. As I talked about, this is good for theming, and that's cool if you specify all the variables that a widget might need. But a lot of times you're going to want to set up some default values for your widget in case the user doesn't want to specify everything. Usually they'll use your styles, and maybe they'll tweak a little bit. It's a little bit hard to do right now. You have a fallback value you can give, but you have to use that fallback value every single time you use the var function. Something like this, syntax is not settled, this is just an example syntax, would let you set up a variable only if somebody else doesn't override it. That seems useful enough to me. In this case, the main color variable would be set to blue only if nobody else sets it to blue, and there's no main color being inherited. Even inheritance will wipe this out. This is a very, very weak rule in the cascade. A final bit of future is type annotations. I showed off a bit how you can, for example, have a box shadow with the blur being defined by a variable. And that's cool, but what if you wanted to animate it? You could have the entire box shadow property be in the animation keyframes, but if you put a variable in the keyframes just so you only animate the shadow, it won't work like you expect. The variable looks like it's a length. It said 1 pixel or 5 pixel, but at the time it's inside of the custom property, we have no idea what the hell it is. It looks like a length there, sure, but if it's just a number, it could be a number or an integer. If it's a keyword, it could be a color, it could be a counter style. There's tons of ways to interpret most values. And so until they're used in a real property, we have no idea what they are. And thus we can't animate them well. So something like this for annotating a variable with a type would allow us to do animations and transitions directly on variables in a nice, elegant way. Here I have just a hash token. It looks like a color, sure, but who knows? It could be an ID selector. So I declare it to be a type color. And further down, I declare a keyword to be of type color as well. Now we know what the hell it is, and we can say, cool, let's transition it as a color. Simple and easy. I think that's the real one. No, next one. OK. And then, like I said before, variables are the start of user extensible CSS. I would like CSS to be more or less completely user extensible. Everything, or almost everything that we can do in CSS, you should be able to touch, you should be able to hook into, you should be able to control either in CSS or in JavaScript. That way you can do a lot of cool things yourself, and then we can know about it. We can see what becomes popular and add it in to be more efficient and available to everybody. So here's a few things that we're going to go over. The first one, user-defined media queries. I think Daniel will touch in a bit in his media query presentation coming up. So look out for that. But anything in CSS is potentially available here. We can have functions. You can do your own gradient function, maybe. Who knows? Pseudo classes to use in selectors, maybe pseudo elements. Mix-ins, if you use Sass or less, these are really interesting ways to extend properties in a way that you can't do well right now, where you can say, mix-ins, you take a group of properties and their values and sub them in. Let's see. A better way to phrase it, I'm being dumb right now, sorry. Where a variable takes a single value and lets you substitute it in anywhere, a mix-in takes a block and lets you substitute that in anywhere a block is expected. And then finally, extend from Sass. I think I can get that in as well. If you've never used it, it's amazing. It lets you more or less define one type of selector to be equivalent to another one, which sounds dumb until you realize that's basically subclassing, which means you can take, say, a warning message and make a special type of warning message that inherits all the normal properties of the main message type. I really recommend reading the documentation for this. There's some great examples in the Sass documentation. It's a really interesting concept, and it's been brought up independently by some of the people in the CSS working group. David Barron from Mozilla, for example, brought up something that I pointed out was identical to extend, just with a worse syntax. So we can probably come up with something like this, get it into the browser, and make it a lot easier to maintain your style sheets. So like I said here, this isn't crazy. I'm pretty sure, well, my plans for this year was to get started on some of these. Variables is part of it. Some of the other bits here are something that I would like to pursue later in this year. But in the very near future, my plan is to push these kinds of things in the CSS working group and see what we can get going. I think it's really important to get these done sooner rather than later because they're not really useful until everyone supports them. So I'd like to get them to show up in less than 10 years. Yeah. So I believe that's the real end, yes. All right, so once again, Twitter, plus, website, look at the slides, have fun with them. Feel free to follow me, talk to me, whatever. Plus, I pretty much just post pictures every once in a while. I mainly live on Twitter, so have fun there. So I'm going to open the floor to questions. Like I said, we can do about variables, or we can do literally anything in CSS. I probably have some kind of answer to it. All right, I'm going to let the microphone people decide.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. A question unrelated to variables.
Yep.
What about the CSS hierarchy model?
Yes. So the hierarchy module is nesting CSS. It's what you can do in Sass and Less and pretty much every single preprocessor. It's the very first thing they add. I have a spec that I have in fact, let's just go over to it. Control-T, dev.w3.org/cssvg/css dash hierarchy. Oh, I think I misspelled it. I think it's plural. Hierarchies? Yeah, okay, cool. So this is an unofficial proposal right now. It hasn't been accepted as a working draft, and I think that's a good idea. It's not good enough yet. I really want to pursue this option here. There are some weird syntax issues, though. Sass and Less and whatnot are willing to just, well, I'll explain a little bit better. If we look at something, okay, so look at this right here. We have a table selector, and then down here we have some more junk. Let's blow that up. That's so tiny. All right. So this particular example is distinguishable. Like, as soon as we see an ampersand, that's the nesting selector. It represents the whatever elements were matched by the parent. As soon as we see that, we can go ahead and say, yeah, that's a selector. Let's just do the nesting. But in general, if we wanted to have Sass, for example, lets you do .color table space ampersand, or whatever the hell they use for their nesting bits. In other words, you can nest, but select based on like parents higher up. And those look just like properties to the parser. It's really hard to tell the difference between selectors and properties at the parsing level. And so I need to find a better way to generically distinguish the two, because we can't mix them well right now. And once we do, then I will pursue this really hard. But right now it's on a back burner while I think about the issues. But I really like it, and I really want to do it in the future.
Sorry if I can.
2 questions. You're getting greedy, man.
No, it's about that. But that's to say that was there 1 year ago or something. So what changed actually?
Oh, this was recently updated, but yeah. Wait, not too much has changed. I haven't done anything. I don't even know why this was updated on the 8th. What even happened there? Who knows? Yeah, nothing's much changed there. I just haven't been able to give it much thought yet. So I have a lot of other specs to be thinking about at the moment. But I want to figure this out in a way that's not too verbose, that adds very little weight to the spec, and we'll figure it out. We'll see what's going on.
Hey, compared to a lot of the stuff that you've been talking about, this is probably a pretty mundane one, but I imagine it's a problem a lot of people in this room have probably encountered. If you try to use a large image as a CSS sprite, one problem that you encounter is that everything is anchored to XY00 in the top left, which means that you cannot relatively offset anything from the right-hand side. You can only relatively offset from the left. Can something be added to make that possible?
Yeah, actually that already exists.
Really?
So you're probably just thinking of the basic background position syntax where you just give 2 lengths and those are measured from the top and left. You can use keywords to specify which side you want to measure it from. You can say right 10 pixels, top 10 pixels, or use bottom, whatever you want there. Then we can get it off from any offset. But That kind of thing is the use of large sprites hopefully will be disappearing in the next few years anyway. Speedy, HTTP2, is making the use of lots of small files much less painful than it is in current HTTP. So that should reduce a lot of the use for spriting. Additionally, though I don't know what the implementation status is, there's something called, oh shit, what is it called? Media fragments, which lets you take point at a large image and then specify a rectangle out of that you want to use as your actual image. And that way you can use spriting directly without having to worry about all the background position hacks. In particular, it lets you do repeat a lot better, which you can't do well in today's spriting techniques. So yes, your question's directly answered, but hopefully it should be obsolete anyway in a couple of years. Hmm? Well, I think he was first.
Oh. Okay.
We'll come back to you, buddy. He's had his hand up for a little while. Oh, that dude right there. Right there. I'm just singling them out. Everybody stare real quick.
Yeah. Thank you. I just wanted to ask about functions. So basically, what are those functions? Is it like simple macros, so like some shortcuts? Can you use variables? If you can, then does the value returned by the function depend on the context, on the position in the tree or something? So,
not defined yet. I have no idea. So the basic variables or the basic function stuff is just, there's functions all over CSS. Var is one function, a very special one. Gradients are another function. There's tons of them. I'm not sure exactly what it will look like, but it'll call back out to JavaScript somehow. It'll be given all the arguments that you give the function in CSS, maybe some more context, and it'll return probably some equivalent CSS stuff. It'll probably be a lot like a variable, except JavaScript does the work of actually interpreting it and figuring out what to do, such that it gets replaced by some real CSS outside of there. But I haven't given a lot of thought to it yet. I want to do that, but I don't know what's going on at the moment.
Yeah, but actually it's also interesting because now it's like...
Wait, hold up, microphone.
Yeah, sorry. Actually, it's also interesting because now it's pretty deterministic. So we define variables once, and then everything is defined. But if we introduce like JavaScript execution or something, then there may be a non-deterministic values on different invocations and so on.
Yes,
so it's
figuring out how to make that deterministic and just predictable in general is going to be a hard problem, but one we have to solve. I have a couple of ideas about how to do that already, because I've thought about how to put randomness into CSS, and I think there are ways we can do this. My current syntax ideas are a little bit awkward, but hopefully we can find some better ways that'll make it really natural to express. Something needs to be done about that, though. Yes, you can't just do a naive expression where you just call the JavaScript every time it shows up or something.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, thanks for your talk, and good to be back again. I had a question about the subject selector for selectors.
Which selector?
The subject selector.
Subject selector. Yes.
What's the current state of it, and do you have an opinion on which Unicode character would be useful?
Hey,
or just the Unicode snowman or something?
Yeah, so at the moment, determining the subject. This is the one he's talking about, everybody. Selectors 4, section 3.2. Right now, we're still kind of stuck on just using a bang as the indicator there. Here's the example here. So if nobody's familiar with this, OL, angle only, LI only child. This right now selects the LI. You can use the subject indicator defined in subject selectors 4 to say, no, select the OL, but only if it has an LI as its first child. So it runs the selector and then just backs up and finds the things that you actually want to be selecting and styling. Right now we're just stuck on the bang. We still have an issue in there for what else we might do. It has to be something in ASCII, because we're stuck. Everything we define in CSS will be in ASCII, but we don't know. Now, as to status, the subject indicator is right now put into the complete profile of selectors. We've split it up into two halves, well, not even halves, two pieces. The fast profile, which is almost everything, and then the complete profile, which is the cream on top. The fast profile is supported by browsers in normal CSS. The complete profile contains a couple of extra slow things, extra expensive things, but which are really cool, like the subject indicator. Right now, they will not work in normal CSS. They're expected to work, though, in things like document.query selector. Any place where you can run selectors a little bit more slowly, where you have a little bit more time to run them in and it won't matter as much if they're slow, that's where the subject indicator should be supported. But I don't think any browser has begun implementation of it yet. So right now it's still kind of in the air. So we'll see what happens with it.
I have an extra comment on this. I implemented it 17 years ago, so it means it's not ready yet.
Okay.
This is about SAS and less and other preprocessors that I'm unaware of. Oh, stylus, I guess. It seems to me that these guys are thinking up new stuff as they go along, and people adapt it because it's really smart, and they don't have to talk to every browser and discuss everything that you have to do. So, to me, even though the implementation of, for instance, variables and other stuff looks really good, I mean, in my mind, I see Apple implementing copy and paste in iOS in 2011, and you know what I mean. You're working on something that other people have already worked out, and because you have to talk to all the other people and make it a standard, you're always behind.
Yeah.
So how? Yeah, that's not nice. How does it?
That's the point, though. Yeah, that's the point, though. But see, here's the secret. We let you all have the tools to do cool stuff, and then we just come back behind, grab the best ideas, and bask in the glory. We get to pretend. Yeah. This lets us pretend that we're really smart and have our finger on the pulse, when really we're just letting everyone else do the work for us. That's the intention here. We want to allow everyone else to do whatever they want, to do, like, let 1,000 flowers bloom. And then whatever's the most popular stuff, we'll take it, we'll make it faster, we'll make it available to everyone without having to link in extra libraries, etc. And just make it part of the core language. Yeah, after the fact, but that's better. It's better for us to come along afterwards and pick the winners than try to predict what's going to be winning ahead of time, because we're going to get it wrong. And so that's the intentional behavior of this stuff. We want it to act that way.
Can you give the microphone there?
Thank you. Hi.
Hi.
I have a question. I had trouble finding an answer on Stack Overflow to it. Maybe it's easy for you. If I want to access the properties of CSS class from JavaScript, and there's no element on in the DOM that actually has that class, is it possible to access it?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to go through the style sheets. In fact, I'll show you right now. All right, so we're looking up there. Let's bring up the script one. Let's make this a little bit. Oh, geez, it's so tiny. Whatever, good enough. All right. Document.stylesheets0. No, stop it. All right, so let's bump this up a little bit more, make it a little bit bigger. Good enough. All right, so this is a nice object, the style sheet object, that's full of all the rules. We have a CSS rules list right here. Let's open that up. And it has all the rules in the style sheet that you can go iterate in JavaScript and look at them. You see the text of it, like the whole text. You can get just the selector, HTML. You can get the style object, which contains all the properties I've set, etc. You can do, this is not a very convenient interface. I would not design it this way if I were designing it today, but hey, it's all there. Everything you need to get out from the style sheet is present in the CSS OM. Just look at document.stylesheets, and it's all the either linked in or literal style elements in your document in order.
All right, thanks.
Hi.
Yo.
I was wondering, I've seen some stuff about new variables, like the root m element variable. What's it
like
called?
Earlier in the like the rem unit?
Yeah, the rem unit and the WH and WV units, I think they're called. I was wondering, are there any more coming?
Quite a bit, yeah. So you want to look at the values spec, CSS Dash Values, and it has all the units that are defined across CSS. There's a few things that are defined just in particular specs if they're only applicable to that spec, but a whole bunch of things that are applied across CSS are defined here. For example, related to text, we have, the M, the X unit, which is the X height, the ch, which is the width of a 0, or I think the width of a space, I forget, the rem, which is the root M, etc. All the VH units that are relative to the viewport, all these things. Just look at this. There's a couple of nice new ones here. I plan to start values 4 probably next year. There's some ideas that need to go in there. So just keep following this spec or its successors, and it should have all the nice information for you.
Hi. How do variables interact with import rules and various style sheets? Will they share the variables? Or?
Yes. They all go into a big global namespace and all intermingle, which isn't, well, no, never mind, they don't do that anymore. What am I talking about? Yeah, no, it is a property. Custom properties are properties like anything else. They all just apply to the element, they all mix together, and the cascade figures out who the winner is. So you don't have to do anything special. It's no new concepts. It's exactly like any other property that's pulled in from multiple style sheets. Just behind you, pass it backwards. Yeah.
Hello, this is not a CSS question, but are image progress events being implemented already, or
what progress events?
Image progress events. So no when I'm loading an image,
I know what you're talking about. I know the things that you're talking about, but I don't know their progress. Yeah, I'm not sure what how far along they are in implementation right now. So, not happening? Okay, they're telling me it's not happening.
Yeah, there's something like Shadow DOM,
yes.
And you can style it with CSS. What's the status on that? Is that soon or?
Yeah. So he's asking about Shadow DOM. You notice in my presentation I talked about web components a little bit. That's what all that's involved in. Shadow DOM, by the way, if you're not familiar with it, you should go look it up. Look up web components right now. You all have computers. Google it. Web components is a way to get things like jQuery's components or UE components or whatever, where you start with a basic element, you throw some JavaScript at it, and it transforms into something complicated, like a date picker or something like that. And right now, in today's world, that means a lot of extra DOM, a lot of extra elements get dumped in there, and that can screw things up. You can accidentally style them because they're just in the page. And you didn't intend to, sure, but it can happen. Shadow DOM hides away that extra HTML into a little pocket dimension or whatever. So it still acts exactly like it was on the page, except you can't style it by accident, etc. So as to progress, it's going well. Our Blink implementation is nearing completion. Firefox is not far behind. WebKit is not so good. Everybody who is implementing Shadow DOM in WebKit before the split between Safari and Chrome was on the Chrome side. So all of them are now working on Blink, and there's nobody left on WebKit who knows what the hell to do with Shadow DOM code. So they are removing the code right now with anticipating they'll put it back in later when somebody has the time to really dive deep into it. But there are significant and pretty good polyfills for this in JavaScript right now. If you look at Polymer, it was previously called Tool Kitchen, it's now Polymer. That's an internal team at Google and elsewhere. It started out internal, now it's just kind of open source and whatnot. They maintain a polyfill for web components. Mozilla also does, called Xtags. Either of those work great if you want to use web components today, use Shadow DOM and whatnot. It's a little slower and a little bit funky to use, but it works pretty well. It still lets you use custom tags, etc. So I expect Shadow DOM and web components in general to be usable in Mozilla and in Blink, i.e. Chrome, in the next year or so. Usable in IE or Safari will probably wait a little bit longer, but the polyfills are pretty nice, so that should suffice. Mm-hmm.
Is it possible to use scoped style sheets to, is there a simpler way than resorting to web components and the Polymer project to separate the styling of two elements on the page?
Absolutely, you just use a scoped style sheet. If you just put the scoped attribute on a style element, it will only apply those styles to the style element's parent and its descendants, all the things around it. It won't escape out into the rest of the page. That requires you to use inline styles, but you can always use an import rule to pull in an external style sheet and just scope it to that little bit there. So that's an okay solution.
So basically you put a div and then within this div an add import and put scope on top of that.
Yeah,
okay.
Watch this.
We just put a style attribute inside of this. Saying style scope equals true.
Okay, use the cheap thing here. So some div, style, let's blow this up a bit, it's too tiny. Style scoped. And then an A rule here will only apply to like this thing. It will not apply to an element down here. So you can use nice, small selectors that don't have to worry about specificity or anything, and without having to go through all the complication of using web components. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, you just saved me hours of work. Thanks.
This is defined over in the HTML spec. So if you want to go to... No, not well yet. But if you want to look it up, what it will be later, whatwg.org/HTML. That's the good HTML spec. You look at that one. All right, anyone else?
What about scoped media queries inside this style element?
Oh, so like if you had media stuff there?
Yeah.
Media queries will still work. They're applied, media queries are all based on the document, so they'll just be big. You might be asking about like element queries. If you want to know, you want to apply different styles based on whether the div is a certain width or something.
Exactly, yeah.
That's a really hard problem, and I go into detail about this on my blog. So we'll just head over there real quick. Listing of all posts. All right, you want to look up element queries on April 10th. It's right a few bits down. This explains the basic issues with it, how we can possibly solve them, and what the future would be. I think it is something we can do. I've talked about it a lot on the www style mailing list, the CSS working group mailing list. It's hard to get it to work right without some weird circularity issues. Like say, if my container is less than 300 pixels, I want to be 400 pixels and make it like blow up again. What do you do then? Because it's going back and forth. But it's possible. We should figure out some way to do this.
Yeah, cool.
All right, thank you everybody.